Hi, I'm Hank Huffnagel. This is a picture of Main Street in Clarion, Pennsylvania in 2016. It's changed some since my boyhood days back in the 1950s, but the front of that gray building at the left has not changed much at all. That's our library. If you were to walk up to the front steps and look up, you'd see that the name of the place is the Ross Memorial Library. For over 130 years, from about 1840 until the 1970s, members of the Ross family were well known in the Clarion community. They were a remarkable bunch, but now they're gone, and all that remains of them are the library and the grand old homes they built. I don't pretend to know the whole story of the Rosses, but let me tell you some of what I do know. The library is a memorial to this woman, Mary Ann Wilson Ross. She was born in 1822, the youngest daughter of Clarion County pioneers Robert and Sarah Wilson. Her mother died when Mary Ann was still a baby, and so she was cared for by her sister, Mrs. Isaac Jones. Mary Ann grew up in exciting times. She was just 2 when the stagecoaches started to run on the brand-new Susquehanna and Waterford Turnpike, which is Route 322 today. When she was 6, the town of Strattonville was laid out, and when she was 12, her older brother Samuel opened the first store in the new town. Robert's store prospered. Goods were brought there from Philadelphia in Conestoga wagons drawn by 6 horses. The wagons then went back loaded with flax, clover seed, rags, and deer and bear hides. People came to Wilson's store from miles around to get supplies, to trade, and to socialize. I like to think of Mary Ann Wilson as a teenager in the midst of all this excitement. When Mary Ann was 17, the biggest excitement of all began. Suddenly, overnight, they were all living in a new county. Some of the older folks were not at all happy, but by 1839 the population of the area had begun to grow. And on March 11th of that year, Clarion County was formed from parts of Venango and Armstrong. Both Strattonville and Shippenville fought hard to be the county seat. But the county commissioners decided to build a new town halfway between the two, to be called Clarion. And while Clarion was being built, business boomed in nearby Strattonville. Mary Ann was no doubt thrilled by all the excitement. Everyone had a grand plan. Everyone saw a chance to get in on the ground floor of a good thing. There were builders and laborers, merchants and hotel men staying in Strattonville. There were doctors and lawyers hanging out their shingles. Dr. James Ross came to Strattonville in 1840, where his first medical office was in his room at the Barber Hotel. He had been born in Indiana County, Pennsylvania in 1813 and gotten his medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania. He was 27 when he decided to move to the new Clarion County and try his luck. I sometimes try to imagine the first meeting of beautiful 18-year-old Mary Ann Wilson with her future husband, the exotic Dr. James Ross. I sometimes try to imagine what their wedding in 1841 was like. Shortly after they wed, the Rosses moved to a large home on Liberty Street in Clarion. For the first dozen years, only the back half of the house was complete. Dr. James Ross was a good and successful physician. The Rosses were pleasant people, and for many years their house was a favorite place for social gatherings. Clara, their first child, was born in 1842, but then died in 1843 when she was just 18 months old. This little girl must have been nearly the first child to be buried in the Clarion Cemetery. The years passed and the family grew. Every second year seemed to be the occasion of another birth. J. Frank Ross was born in 1844, Albert in 1846, and Elizabeth in 1848. It was perhaps in the 1850s that the Rosses had their portraits painted, and it was not long after that sons Frank and Albert cut a hole and inserted a cigar in their father's mouth to make his picture more lifelike. And still the family grew. Mary C. Ross was born in 1850. William H. in 1852, Annie Sutton in 1854, and James in 1857. Jenny J. was born in 1859, but then died at the age of 2 in 1860. What a prodigious amount of offspring! After John Dean Ross was born in May of 1861, there were 8 children living at home. Quite a mob even by the standards of the time. Dr. Ross was frequently away tending to his medical duties, and perhaps by that time oldest son Frank was accompanying him. As for the rest, their mother looked after them. By all accounts, Mary Ann Ross was a wonderfully pleasant person who had a special affinity for children. She was also a deeply committed Presbyterian. There were many things to pray for, but high on her list must have been prayers for the health of her husband and children. Dr. Ross was frequently near the sick and dying, and might catch something. Her youngsters were growing up in an era when half of all children typically died before reaching adulthood. Probably the worst days of Dr. James and Mary Ann Ross's lives came later that same year. On September 14, 1861, son James died. He was 5. A week later, 7-year-old daughter Annie followed her brother to the grave. And finally, in yet another week, 12-year-old Mary passed away. The cause of these deaths is unknown today, but may have been some infectious disease such as scarlet fever or smallpox. In 1865, the family lost one more child, little 2-year-old Sally. That made 6 deaths, and even today you can't help but be saddened when you visit the cemetery and see the 6 small stones commemorating the Rosses' lost children. It was in 1867 that the last of the 12 Ross children was born, another boy christened Charles Clifford Ross. In all, they had had 6 boys and 6 girls. 5 girls and 1 boy died during childhood. 5 boys and 1 girl lived to be adults. That year, the oldest son, Frank, was away finishing his medical education at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And number 2 son, Albert, was finishing his education at the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis, Maryland. The other 4 children, ranging in age from newborn to 19-year-old, were still living at home. Some years later, Mary Ann Ross had her picture taken, and it is this later portrait of her that is most seen today. She looks to be a severe, sad sort of a person, but according to the people who knew her, the real Mrs. Ross possessed a sunny, genial nature, and her home was made cheerful and bright by her presence. She carried her youthful sprightliness into advancing life, and was a marked example of one whose declining years were touched with a peculiar charm. By 1877, the Rosses had been living in Clarion for nearly 40 years. Perhaps you can see a familiar building or two in this picture taken from the pastures at the corner of 3rd and South. Life was very different back then. Gas and electricity were years in the future. The waterworks had only recently been completed, and most people still used water from wells. The town had less than 1,000 residents. It was on June 12, 1877, that Dr. Frank Ross, the oldest son, married Miss Sadie Markilly of Hudson, Ohio. Later that same year, they moved into their newly built home at the corner of South Street and 7th Avenue. The house still stands today. This is the hall of that home as it appeared some years later. Here is a view of the parlor. The next year, 1878, Elizabeth Ross, the only surviving daughter, at the age of 30, married John B. Patrick, a prominent lawyer of the town. Mr. Patrick's law office still stands today along 5th Avenue, across from the park. Later, in 1883, Mr. Patrick became editor of the Clarion Republican newspaper, and was thereafter much involved in Clarion County politics. The old newspaper office where he used to work is another building that survives to this day. It's located along Main Street, across from the library. That same year of 1883, on July 31st, Dr. James Ross died at the age of 70. The whole community mourned his passing. The newspaper said that for over 40 years Dr. Ross traveled a great part of Clarion County in the practice of his profession. Always and everywhere, day and night, he was ready to attend to the call of duty. His profession was his life work. He was a man of unusual abilities, and he was for many years the most prominent physician of the county and the most widely known. On his death, the practice of medicine that Dr. James Ross had started in Clarion in its earliest days passed fully to his eldest son, Dr. Frank Ross, who had worked with his father for many, many years. It was just 4 years later that Mary Ann Ross died. The notice of her death read as follows. On March 24, 1887, Mrs. Mary Ann Ross died at the residence of her son-in-law, J.B. Patrick, Esquire. It was a Thursday evening, and she was in the 65th year of her long and useful life. During the winter, Mrs. Ross had been feeble, and had rarely been able to visit her children living nearby. On March 17th, while writing to an absent son, she was stricken with paralysis, and lingered until the evening of the 24th, when she so gently fell asleep that those around could scarcely tell the moment of her departure. She was a woman much esteemed for her many virtues. Kind-hearted, cheerful in disposition, and of a courteous nature, she made friends of all, especially children who were attracted to her naturally and never failed to find sympathy and kindness. Many hearts were touched with a deep and sincere sorrow at her passing. Not only a wide circle of relatives, but very many warmly attached friends joined in expressions of grief. After the grieving, the living children of Dr. James and Mary Ann Ross continued with their lives. They had been well raised, and each of them flourished in his or her own way. Dr. Frank Ross was by now the Dr. Ross of Clarion, successfully taking over the family practice after his father's death. Albert Ross was still rising in the U.S. Navy, and in fact missed his mother's funeral because he was away at sea. Elizabeth Ross Patrick soon moved away to Harrisburg, where Mr. Patrick had been appointed to a job with the State Department. William Ross was making great progress in the legal profession, while at the same time very much enjoying his role as husband and father. John Dean Ross had by now left Clarion and gone west to seek his fortune. And finally, Charles C. Ross, the youngest of the brood, was by now attending medical school at the University of Pennsylvania, the same as his father and brother before him. Upon graduation, he joined his older brother in the family practice. The difference in age between the brothers was 23 years, and by all accounts they were both excellent physicians. William Ross was the first of the children to die. May 10, 1898, Clarion was abuzz at the news of his sad and untimely death. He was just 46 years old. A few days later, the Clarion Republican had this to say. At 11 o'clock and 45 minutes on Tuesday morning, in the 46th year of his age, the spirit of W. H. Ross passed over the river to the great beyond and left us only his mortal remains. It seems but yesterday that we saw him, full of life, the life that always made others happy. It does not seem possible that he is dead. The cause of his death was Bright's disease. He suffered patiently for 6 weeks before the final end came. For the last 3 days he has been unconscious, and the end was a peaceful and painless one. The list of William's accomplishments is amazing for one so young. He was the first ever Burgess of Clarion. He was attorney for the Fox Estate and the Pittsburgh and Western Railroad. He was a director of the Second National Bank of Clarion. He was a trustee of the Normal School. He was also much interested in the Clarion Waterworks. But that was not all. When the day was done, William went home to his wife and 6 children. His house on 7th Avenue still stands today. William Ross seems to have possessed the same geniality and kindness of spirit as his mother. One newspaper editor wrote, "He was a man that to know made life happier. His jovial disposition imparted itself to all who came in contact with him. Time and time again have we left Mr. Ross after a conversation with him feeling brighter." The next death was on July 28, 1905. This time it was Dr. Frank Ross, the oldest son. He was 61 years old. Dr. Ross was one of the leading physicians of northwestern Pennsylvania, and indeed enjoyed a reputation which went beyond the bounds of the state, having been honored by his election as Vice President of the American Medical Association. As a family physician and surgeon, he possessed those characteristics which endeared him to his patients and won for him a large clientele. He was a very able, cheerful, and accurate physician, patient and untiring in his work. The next to pass away was John D. Ross, who died on Wednesday, August 18, 1920, at the age of 59. He had just undergone an operation for gallstones. The newspapers of the time had this to say of the man: John D. Ross was born in Clarion and received his education and grew to manhood here. As a young man, he left Clarion to carve out a place in the busy world and to make his fortune. He went to the Great West and finally located in Denver, Colorado, where in 1882, at the age of 21, he opened a cigar and tobacco store, which, under his wise business management, grew into one of the largest wholesale and retail cigar and tobacco houses west of Chicago. His place of business became the headquarters of a widely extended circle of prominent businessmen. Mr. Ross got interested in politics as a Republican and was twice elected to the Denver City Council at a time when the city was growing by leaps and bounds. From the age of 50, for 9 years, John D. Ross traveled to almost all parts of the world in search of pleasure and also in search of health. For even as long ago as that, he felt the necessity of getting some help for his physical condition. Never in all those years, though, did he lose touch with his friends in his hometown of Clarion, and after his death it was found that he had left the community a magnificent bequest of about $160,000. This was to be used to construct a modern library building and community center as a memorial to the memory of his mother, Mary Ann Ross. Due to some disputed provisions in his will, it was nearly 9 years later that the library was finally built, and before then 2 more deaths had occurred. In 1923, Elizabeth Ross Patrick died of a stroke at the age of 75. Early in youth, she had professed her faith in her Savior and become an active member of the First Presbyterian Church of Clarion. She was a most devoted worker in the Sunday School, the Missionary Society, and in the general work and welfare of the church. The building where she labored is still there today, behind the park in Clarion. At the time she was first overtaken by the stroke, Mrs. Patrick was teaching a class of young women in the Market Square Presbyterian Church of Harrisburg. She was a woman of pleasant, genial disposition, and her kindly, sunny ways always made her friends wherever she went. The body of Mrs. Patrick was brought to Clarion, where funeral services were conducted at her brother, Dr. C.C. Ross's home, after which she was interned in the Patrick family lot in the Clarion Cemetery. The next to pass away was Rear Admiral Albert Ross, the second son of Dr. James and Mary Ann Ross. When still in his teens in the 1860s, he had left Clarion to enter the Naval College at Annapolis in Maryland. Thereafter, the Navy was his home. Albert Ross graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1867. After 2 years' service as a midshipman on sea duty, he was advanced to ensign and later through various grades to the rank of Rear Admiral. He received his commission for that rank on October 13, 1908. At various times he commanded U.S. ships that visited all parts of the world. Among his special qualifications, he had great ability in training recruits, and was rated a very efficient officer in converting landlubber recruits into expert seamen and navymen. For this reason he was frequently placed in command of training ships, such as the USS Alliant, which is shown here. During World War I, Admiral Ross was inspector of regular and reserve training activities. At another time, he served as lighthouse inspector for the eastern seaboard. At another period, he was inspector of all collieries of the Navy, and in that capacity traveled over the entire world. Admiral Ross died in 1926 at the age of 81. The funeral was held in Annapolis, and he was interred in the Naval Cemetery. Now only one of the children remained. He was the youngest of them all, Dr. Charles C. Ross, the third and last of the Ross family doctors who labored in Clarion. It was he who saw to the building of the library under the terms of his late brother John D.'s will. He himself contributed a further $30,000 to the building fund, and in late 1929 the cornerstone was finally laid. Work on the library continued all that winter, and by the end of 1930 the building was complete, just in time to serve as a community resource during the Great Depression. Charles C. Ross, as trustee of his brother's estate, must have been very happy when the library project was finally complete and he could turn to other concerns. It was just 9 years later, in 1939, that he passed away, the last of the 12 children. The newspaper read, funeral services were held Tuesday afternoon at his late home for Dr. Charles C. Ross of Clarion, well-known and highly regarded member of a family of physicians who have ministered to the ill and injured of this community for the greater part of a century. Dr. Ross himself had practiced in Clarion since 1892. As Clarion County Health Officer, Dr. Ross was widely known by young and old alike. He was an active member of the Clarion County Medical Society, of which he was a past president. He was the one responsible for bringing to Clarion in June 1932 the distinguished Dr. Charles Mayo, world-famous surgeon. Dr. Ross had been in ill health since September 1938, but recovered sufficiently to attend to his office for about 2 months past. He became worse a few days ago and died suddenly of a heart attack Saturday evening, August 5th. And so the family of Dr. James and Mary Ann Ross passed away. They left behind their library and their homes, but one and all they were pleasant, intelligent, and sympathetic people, and I like to think that they also somehow contributed to the character of our town. The Ross children had children of their own, a dozen by my count. Most seemed to have left for faraway places, but one at least remained. Take a hard look at this picture of Dr. J. Frank Ross's house in 1892. Up there on the roof of the porch you can see 2 children. These are the sisters Alice and Mary Ross. They grew up in the immense old place, and eventually Mary Ross married a Mr. Stewart of Baltimore, Maryland, and moved away. Alice never did. Alice B. Ross died at the age of 84 on May 7, 1962. She was a graduate of Wilson College in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, and taught school in Clarion for a good many years. She was involved with Clarion State Teachers College and in the formation of the Historical Society. When her will came to be read, it was found that she had left $30,000 in cash, stocks, and bonds to the Clarion Free Library to establish a memorial fund for her late father, Dr. J. Frank Ross. She thus became the 3rd member of her family to make substantial contributions to the library or the building that houses it. When I was a boy in the 1950s, I would attend the Saturday morning story reading sessions on the ground floor of the library, and I would stare suspiciously at the portrait that is still on the wall down there even today. Mary Ann Ross, 1822 to 1887, the label reads. When I was a boy, she was a person from long, long ago, and she looked so very old, so very dour. Now that I'm looking a little that way myself, and I know much more about her, I have a different word to describe her and her family. Remarkable.